US debt ceiling crisis. Now, what is this debt ceiling crisis? Before that, we just have to note down a couple of things. That any national government will incur any debt when it spends more than it earns. Okay, so when its expenditure is higher than the revenue. Okay, so simple rule is this: expenditure is higher than the revenue is your fiscal deficit, and this fiscal deficit has to be financed from by taking some loans or debt. Okay, now what the revenues can be? Revenues can come from taxation. Revenues can come from in the form of dividends that the government get because of the investment it makes. It can come from other sources such as providing services. Okay, so there can be multiple sources of revenues. Okay, so when there is a mismatch in this in favor of expenditure, that means expenditure is larger than revenue, then we will have a situation of debt. Okay, now when it comes to crisis, US debt crisis, that means USA's debt has reached to certain levels that it is not able to finance it. Now, the capability of USA's to finance this debt is not related to its capacity to pay. It is related to a limitation imposed upon the USA's government by its parliament, by its own parliament. Okay, so parliament has something called Second Liberty Bond Act, which puts ceiling or limit on how much the federal government can borrow. Okay, presently there is a ceiling of $31.4 trillion. Okay, so this is the ceiling. Now, if USA's debt increases this amount, it cannot borrow it from the market, and for that the crisis is that they have to broker a deal with the parliament so that the parliament can waive this ceiling and allow the government to borrow it from the market. Okay, now let us understand how government borrows it. The standard mechanism of borrowing from market by the government is to issue bonds. So government issues bonds. Whoever pays the government for the bonds is promised some interest over its principal value. Okay, so they will be getting some interest because they are basically lending to the government. Okay, now if government is at the verge of default, that means the government is not able to repay these bond holders, right? So that bond will overnight become only a piece of paper without any value, right? Because anybody who holds the bond is not assured whether they will get their money in return after they present the bond back to the government. Okay, so this means the bond price in the market will fall. The reason is the demand for bonds, because any instrument's price are determined by demand and supply. The demand for bonds will fall. Okay, so the bond prices will fall. Now, take it as a rule that bond prices and interest rate are opposite. Whenever the bond prices will fall, the interest rate will rise. So they are inversely related. Okay, so when the interest rate is rising in an economy, interest rate is rising for the government, people will borrow less, they will defer their expenditure, so they will not buy any movable, immovable property, they will spend less. Okay, so it will impact the overall aggregate demand in the economy, so it will impact the economic growth. Okay, so now we can understand that the default by the US government can be a serious issue for its own domestic economy, because it will have higher interest to pay, and higher interest means they will have more debt to pay. That means the taxpayer will have to pay more. Now, the root cause of this crisis, obviously the fiscal policies of the government are there, but there is also structural cause. What is the structural cause? See, it is the parliament in United States which has the capability and authority to authorize the expenditure by the government. So it approves the policies and the plans of the government. Okay. So let's say parliament has approved the policies worth rupees or $100 worth of programs and policies is approved by the parliament. Okay. Now, government earns from various sources the revenue which amounts to $70. So what the government earns is $70. Okay. What the government spends is $100. So there is excess of $30 that government is spending. Now this $30 rupee of bill, government is obliged to pay to the contractors, etc., or service providers because of the consumption by the government, okay, for its various policies and program. And to repay them, government needs to borrow it from the market. Here comes the catch. Now the very same parliament which has authorized 100 rupees of expenditure has put the restrictions on government's debt it can take, and that amount to, for example, $15. Now the government cannot borrow more than the $15 because of the ceiling imposed on it. So, but government's need to borrow is $30. So the excess $15 is unable to borrow, so it can default. Now this situation has arisen because of the structural issue. Why? Number one, it is the parliament which authorized the $100 of expenditure, and it is the same parliament which also capped or limited the power of the government to borrow from the market to $15 only. Okay, so this is just a small hypothetical example just to make you understand what was the actual problem in this situation. So now, it's not just local problem. That's something that we have to understand here. It's also going to have global ramifications. Let's understand this. See, who buys the bonds that the government issues? Okay. It is also the foreign governments who buys the bonds. Okay. For example, China is one of the biggest lender to the US economy because they end up investing heavily in the US Treasury bonds. Okay. So the moment the bond prices are following, then foreign governments who are holding the bonds are also going to be impacted because their value is also going to diminish. Number one thing. Okay. Number two things is the foreign exchange reserves of other countries. Dollar being an important currency, hard currency, if convertible currency, it is therefore an important component of foreign exchange reserves. So if we see globally, the world countries hold more than 50% of their exchange, foreign exchange, in the form of dollar, US dollars. So what is happening here? Let us understand. See, because if I want to buy a bond from the market, what I will have to do? I can buy it only using the dollars. I cannot go directly and pay the rupee and get the bond from the US, right? I will first have to convert the rupee into dollar, and then I can buy from that dollar the bond. Since the bond demand is falling, what will happen? The demand for dollars will also fall. Because bonds demand and the dollars demand are directly related. So when I don't want to buy bonds, I will not demand more dollars, right? So I will not hold dollars. Therefore, the demand for dollars will also fall. And therefore, the market price of the dollar in terms of other currencies will also fall. So the prices of dollars are also, or the cost or the value of dollar is also going to fall. When the value of dollar will fall, then countries who are holding over 50% of their foreign exchange in the form of dollars, their value will also fall. So suddenly overnight, India might realize that India's overall foreign exchange value has reduced by 10%. For example, just an example. It can be 20%, it can be less than that also, depending upon which way the cow sits, right? So the thing is that demand for bond is directly going to influence the demand for dollar, because it is the dollar using which we can buy the bond. If I don't want to buy the bond, I will not buy the dollars. So naturally the demand for dollar will also come down. As a result, the value of dollar will be impacted, and as a result, the value of the foreign exchange reserves that the other countries are holding will be impacted. So therefore, it is going to have a global ramifications. Okay, so this is something that we have to understand, because it is very, very conceptual issue in nature, right? Now, it can also have some geopolitical consequences, because we are reading the IR, so we have to see it in terms of international relations perspective. See, China is one country which always seeks and looks for these kind of opportunities, because wherever the USA is weakening, China sees it as opportunity to strengthen itself. Now, USA's dollar is an important currency, it's a hard currency, and it's a most frequently used and trusted currency. China wants to increase or enhance the status of its own currency, renminbi, to the same status, right? Presently, only 3% of the global transactions are settled in renminbi or yuan, the Chinese currency. It wants to enhance it, and therefore, the moment the USA's value, dollar's value will fall, China will try to seize the opportunity and will push for more utilization of its own currency so that it internationalizes renminbi. So this is an important Chinese goal. So right, so we have to try and see the overall geopolitical significance and importance of this issue. Now let us see what is there in the article. Now recently the deal has been brokered so that the ceiling that is provided by the parliament is been relaxed so that the government do not default. So this crisis as of now has been averted. Okay. However, the crisis, let's see the history of it, how it originated. See, it originated in the event of First World War, because Congress or Parliament that we call is USA, it calls Congress, right? So Congress cannot be functioning all the time. But for war, the USA president needed to finance the expenditure, right? But the problem was this, that in those times, whenever you want to incur an expenditure, it has to have authorization from the Congress. But this was a hurdle to finance the war, right? So what Congress did, it allowed the president to incur the expenditure, but with a limit. So this is how the ceiling has came. Okay. So to allow the then president to take out funds for the First World War without waiting for the approvals of the absent congressmen. Okay. However, the Congress created a limit on borrowing. That means it doesn't give a blank check, right? It created a limit, right? Thus creating a debt ceiling that could only be raised by the approval of the Congress, right? So without the approval of the Congress, the ceiling limit cannot be raised. And this is what the government of United States was trying to achieve at this point in time also. So debt ceiling, this is how about the history of this debt ceiling. Let's move ahead. What will happen if US default? So its ramifications will be both internal for the United States as well as external, right? So we have to focus on both sides, both internal and external, and I have explained it very well to you, both the sides of it. Let us look at it, what is written here. If the debt ceiling is not raised, once the government reaches the ceilings and run out of cash, US would be unable to pay its debt holders, resulting in default. Once it defaults, what is going to happen? Number one, government will not be able to pay its bill. Okay, so salaries and interest payments, etc. will not be paid. So it will impact the demand and economic growth as well as the employment creation in the economy. It can trigger the global financial crisis. How? If government cannot make interest payments to domestic and foreign investment, it could plunge the globe into financial crisis. As I told you, foreign governments are also holding their large amount of savings into the USA's bond. So if the bond prices are going to crash, it is also impacting the value of those countries also, right? A drop in US consumer confidence would translate to shocks in financial market, tipping the economy into recession. Now, economy of USA going to the recession itself is a huge task. For example, it is for India, largest exports of India goes to the USA, right? So if USA comes into the crisis, our export market is also going to come into the recession, right? So it will impact our exports going to the USA. Therefore, our economic growth will also be suffering because of this. More than half of world's foreign currency reserves are held in US dollars. So the value of US dollars declines, then that means it will impact the value of the foreign exchange reserves of the countries also. And why the value will decline of dollar, I have explained this process and mechanism. Creditworthiness of USA's government will decline, and as a result of this, borrowing cost for the government will also increase because of the creditworthiness. Right? When the borrowing cost increases, that means it will further put pressure on the revenues of the government, and people of the United States will have to pay more taxes as a result of that.